Lots of people are asking if there are alternatives. One prominent writer, Larry Elliott, the economics editor for The Guardian Weekly, asked the question that you see on the screen last August: is there a better, or is it possible to challenge the growth of any cost model and come up with a better alternative? Well, let's put it this way. You can certainly come up with one using a computer model. Whether we can move to it in real life involves many considerations that are not necessarily contained in the model. But let me show you a better outlook. And here you can see that gross domestic product per capita levels off towards the end of this period, by about 2028 actually. Greenhouse gas emissions have come way down. Unemployment's come down, lower than it's been for the last 40, 50 years. The human poverty index is way down, and still the government has a very respectable debt to GDP ratio. I should say that to achieve this result, again, a number of changes are phased in starting in 2010, but they're not the rapid and draconian changes that I mentioned before. So let's see how we would do this. Well, the first thing you have to do all along is to try to keep macro demand and supply stabilized. And one of the assumptions in this projection is that ultimately the Canadian population would stop growing, and along with that, the labor force would stop growing. This projection is based upon a pretty substantial carbon price, and that's what's leading to the significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. It's the shorter work year, something that both Bob and Tim mentioned, that would allow us to stabilize the economy without having massive unemployment, because we would be able to share out the amount of work in the economy in a slightly different way. And funnily enough, it's not a very huge difference from what we're doing, but it's a significant one, and I think that's a key part of the way forward. And as others have mentioned, we would need more generous anti-poverty programs to bring the poverty index down, because trickle-down doesn't work, and there's no reason to expect that it would work in the future. Well, others have mentioned what would change as we move towards this kind of future. I've got my own list. It overlaps somewhat with the others, but there are some new things on it as well. First of all, we would very much need new meanings and measures of success. This is what the discussion about prosperity is really about. You know, what really matters, and it's not an increase in real GDP. We ought to be smart enough to realize that. To move forward, I think we need much stricter and more explicit limits on the materials, energy, waste, and land use that our economies use. That's the only way I see of really protecting the larger ecosphere from the human enterprise. If we did that, then prices would automatically be more meaningful. They would carry more reasonable and reliable information about the real costs of all of the things that we produce and consume. I think that would also move some way towards producing more durable and repairable products, because they would be less wasteful. Somehow we've got to wean ourselves away from trying to prove our status through consumption, so there would have to be fewer status goods. One way of coming at that is to have more informative advertising, so that the codes by which advertisers operate are taken more seriously. Tim in particular, and I guess Bob as well, mentioned we have to transform the capital stock, and that's true. It's not just our built capital that has to be more efficient, but that's a very good place to start. Technology which we allow to run rampant, I think, has to be screened more effectively. That's a tough thing to do, but I think it's worth paying some more attention to. All of these changes would move us in the direction of being more local and less global. Reduced inequality through the enhanced anti-poverty programs, and less work and more leisure. And finally, there are so many dimensions that have to be considered, but one of the important ones is that our educational systems have to be geared better to educating people for life, not just for work. Well, it's interesting to see that these kinds of ideas that the three of us have talked about have begun to enter the mainstream. Here's a really significant quote from Robert Solow, who won his Nobel Prize, at least in part, for the work he did on economic growth. And he's talking about how the US and Europe may very well find that continued growth will be too destructive in the environment, and that we're too dependent on scarce natural resources, or that we'd rather enjoy the benefits of increased productivity in the form of leisure. And he goes on to say there's no reason at all why capitalism could not survive with slow or even no growth. And I've put a question to the participants in this webcast to see whether you agree with that. A big question, as the last point really of what I have to say today, is whether we can adapt. I think as individuals, it's perhaps trite to say it, but we are adaptable. I'm much more concerned about whether our institutions can adapt. Institutions that, if they were working properly, would help us take the long view, would help us deal with resilience, help us deal with things that we as individuals are really not able to cope with one-on-one. But my perspective on this right now is rather dismal. I think many of our institutions have become increasingly short-sighted and self-interested, and unless we can see some changes there, the outlook does not look very promising, as represented by this picture of a rather gloomy future. But I don't think that's the only future that awaits us. I do think there's a much brighter future out there, but it won't happen automatically. It'll happen as a result of people engaging with the kind of ideas that we've put before you today, and contained very much in Tim's work and my own, and some of Bob's as well. And on that note, I will thank you very much for your attention.